Good evening, everyone. My name is Chris Braunlik, president of the Thomas Jefferson Institute. Now, under normal circumstances, this would be one of our regular federal policy dinners sponsored by the Reinsch Pierce Family Foundation with a fine steak or crab cake dinner. There are two reasons we're not doing that tonight. The first is that in early January, I received from Jim Wordsworth, the owner of our regular meeting place, the JR's Stockyards Inn, a phone call. And Jim told me that the day before he had signed the papers and sold his restaurant and the land under it, and we've all had our last meal at JR's Stockyards. Unfortunately, it will be turned into possibly the last thing Fairfax County needs, more condominiums. JR's was the first of the steakhouses in Northern Virginia, and for a lot of us, this is the end of an era. But Jim's retirement is well earned, and I know everyone who knows him wishes him well. Since that call, we've been studiously looking for another home with easy accessibility and enough space for our dinners, and we expect to finalize things after the General Assembly concludes. But I've looked at the prices, and I can tell you this: no one was as much of a friend to our gatherings as was Jim Wordsworth. Now, the bigger reason, of course, is the subject matter. The immediacy of Russia's invasion of Ukraine demanded an immediacy in this briefing. And the best way for us to do that was going to be an online briefing like this. And no one is better suited to offer you background than the former ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, Ambassador James S. Gilmore III. Many years ago, a friend of mine who is a bit of a foreign policy expert himself had the pleasure of sitting next to Jim Gilmore on the dais at a conservative event. And I asked him afterward how the conversation had went, and he responded, well, he was very, very proud of his accomplishments in the state, but what really got him excited and engaged was to talk about national security and international affairs. He's the most knowledgeable governor I've met on those issues. And that's a key reason President Trump nominated Jim Gilmore for ambassadorship. Known to most Virginians as former governor and attorney general, his long interest and expertise in international and security affairs began during his early days working as a counterintelligence agent in the early 70s, earning a degree from the University of Virginia in International Relations, Russian area studies. During his time as governor, he anticipated the world we now live in, established the first Secretary of Technology position in the nation, and led extensive economic development, including trade missions to more than a dozen countries. In fact, his official travels have taken him probably to more than 24 nations, I lost count, meeting with top diplomats and business leaders in each of them. From 1999 to 2003, Jim Gilmore served as chairman of the congressional panel known as the Gilmore Commission to assess America's capabilities to respond to a terrorist attack. A candidate for the Republican presidential nomination in 2016, prior to his ambassadorship, he served as president and CEO of the American Opportunity Foundation, working to shape the discussion around American society and offer conservative solutions that promise prosperity, national security, and American values. And we are delighted and honored and very pleased to welcome Ambassador Jim Gilmore. Ambassador, welcome.
Good. Thank you very much, Chris. We appreciate very much the work of your foundation. So keep up the good work, and I'm happy to be here with you tonight.
Thank you. This is your situation. I don't know what you have to say, but I am looking forward to it.
Well, why don't I start just by saying a few words, and then I'll turn to you or to questions. And I'm not sure if your audience is in a position to ask questions or not, but I'm happy to do that. I really enjoy it. But
it's a good point. I should add, if you have questions, please put them in the chat room, and we will get to everyone we can tonight. So if anyone in the audience has those questions, I always forget to say that we're out of practice. We've been meeting in real time now. Please put them in the chat room, and we will get to all of them that we can.
Very good. Well, I'll then just take a few minutes so that we can devote a lot of time to the conversation that'll be ginned up by the Q&A. So I'll just lay a little bit of a foundation here. Obviously, the reason we're doing this meeting is because of the war that's going on right now in Ukraine, the Russian aggression and invasion that is underway as we speak. So let me lay a little bit of a foundation for this. People probably are not as aware of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. It's called the OSCE. It stands for the OSCE. The OSCE is an international organization like the United Nations. It's headquartered not in New York, it's headquartered in Vienna, Austria. All 57 countries that are members of this organization send certified ambassadors to this organization. And President Trump invited and asked me to be, nominated me to be the ambassador to the OSCE on behalf of our country. You will go through the same process, all the clearances, all the confirmation by the United States Senate, and I was confirmed unanimously by the United States Senate to go to Vienna. We moved over there, lived in the city. The residence was there. Roxanne and I were there. We met every week, the OSCE, in downtown Vienna at the Hofburg Palace, the old Habsburg Palace down there, at which time all 57 ambassadors always met in a conclave every week to discuss the issues, or at least to state the positions of the various countries on the issues. The organization grew out of the Helsinki Accords of 1976, the final act in connection with that. And it was an organization dedicated to certain principles that were important for taming down the Cold War. The principles that you would not have invasions of other countries by force, you would not change boundaries, that any country was in a position to join with any alliance that it wanted to, that there would be democracy and human rights. That's a nutshell. The organization has everybody basically in the Northern Hemisphere in it. Not only the United States and Canada in it across the transatlantic, but everybody in Europe, all Western Europe, all Eastern Europe, the Balkans, the Baltics, the Scandinavian countries, everybody's in it. The Turks, the Russians, the Ukrainians, and even some countries out in Central Asia. So it's a very large, sophisticated organization. Its primary function, though, is for countries to go in and state their positions and to listen to each other diplomatically so that they know how to react back in their capitals. So I was representing, of course, the Trump administration, but I was mostly representing the United States of America. In addition to those once-a-week meetings, we also had meetings off the record or off site. The Quad met every week personally. That's the British, the French, the Americans, and the Germans. There's a lot of talk out there about how President Trump had diminished the alliances between the Americans and those countries. I can report to you that was not true. The United States remains completely respected in Europe. President Biden didn't have to change that. And that everything was understood, and we met together and we understood we were on the same team. We also met with the Ukrainians every week, the European Union. There were periodic meetings with the countries that were members of Nato. I met with the Turks every week. I met with the Romanians almost every week. I met with the Canadians every week. So this was an opportunity to conduct real, genuine diplomacy in a time of great tension. So that gives you the basic foundation. I hope I didn't bore your listeners too much. So let's talk about what's going on here. While I was there, I didn't meet with the Russians as often as I did the other people. And the reason was that we did not want to send a message to the Russians that their conquest of Crimea was okay and that now we were going to go on with business as usual. But we did have communications back and forth, the Americans and the Russians. We also had social occasions. I actually liked the Russian ambassador very much, and I also liked his staff. But I didn't like what Russia was doing. They were obstructionist. It was clear that they had an agenda of their own, and that agenda was not the old Helsinki Accords and not the old agenda of the OSCE, which represented, of course, the rules of the road, the rules of conduct in Europe and beyond. And they didn't cooperate all that well. The biggest issue, of course, was Ukraine. When I got there, Crimea was already conquered, and the Russians had already occupied the very tip of the eastern Ukraine. They basically pretended that it was a breakaway organization, but it was really a proxy groups for the Russians. The people over there are living a miserable life in that area. They really want to be part of the rest of Ukraine. Ukraine has not surrendered 1 inch of their territorial integrity, as indeed under the rules of the OSCE and the rules of international relations, they should not have to. So this was an ongoing conflict. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe actually was the only organization that placed monitors in eastern Ukraine. We had at one point 1,200 monitors in Ukraine watching the situation and trying to tamp down the violence and tamp down the difficulties there and try to keep at least it from breaking out into a real war. I want to report to everybody here that just in the past day, one of those monitors has been killed. Marina Fanina was an OSCE monitor. She was in one of the southern cities that has been under assault by the Russians and by the breakaway republics there. Artillery attacked that city and she was blown up as she was out trying to get food and groceries for her family there. So we lost one OSCE monitor. This is basically what has been going on now. Of course, when President Biden was elected, I actually expected, Chris, to be continued there. The U.S. was actually prepared to chair the Forum for Security and Cooperation there. Forum for Security organization is a side organization that met strictly on military affairs. They rotate around the different countries, so the United States got to be the chairman of it once every 16 years. And I was actually sworn in as the chairman, and then several days later, the new President Biden got rid of all the Republicans worldwide, vacated about 50 embassies across the world, and I was one of them. So I came back and left it in charge of the State Department, Charge d'Affaires, and that's what happened. Now, after that, I joined the American Foreign Policy Council as an advisor, and they asked me to go with them to Ukraine. So in May of 2021, I went to Ukraine. I visited about 16 ministries, including all the major foreign policy and intelligence ministries. We also traveled down to Mariupol, which is a city on the Sea of Azov. We went out on the Sea of Azov with the Ukrainian Navy, looked right there at the Russian ships that were out there looking into Ukraine. We then put on Kevlar vest and went out onto the battlefield right there in that area. So I came back with a very clear picture of what was going on in Ukraine. Their hope was that we were going to deter this invasion, this attack. But the Ukrainians made it clear to me they would fight. They made it clear to me that they want no part of being a part of a new Russian empire. That also is true, by the way, for all those countries that I participated in at OSCE, including and especially the Eastern European countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. None of these countries, Slovakia, the Slovak Republic, to the Czech Republic, none of these former Soviet conquests want any part of Russia, none at all. And they will stand and fight if necessary. Most of them are members of NATO. The Ukrainians made it clear that they would fight for their sovereignty. They do not see themselves as Russians. As a matter of fact, their history is not pro-Russian. And why would it be? If you remember the Holodomor, during the Stalin times, the Russian people almost destroyed the Ukrainian people. So they remember those things. So that's been the background, Chris, and I've talked longer than perhaps I intended to. Let's say just 1 or 2 words about the current war. The question really is, what's going on here? Why are the Russians doing this? They say that they're trying to take away a threat to them, a NATO threat, a Ukrainian threat. I say to my listeners who are on here tonight that is complete baloney. There is no threat to Russia anywhere, nor to the Russian people, not from NATO, which is an entirely defensive alliance, not from Ukraine, which is just ridiculous, the idea that they would in any way be a threat to Russia. The Russians' motives are elsewhere. Putin wants to reassemble the old Russian Empire. He wants to have a sphere of influence, not only in the old parts of Russia, the Russian Empire, but also Eastern Europe. That's what he wants. He believes that that's the definition of Russian greatness. He probably knows that he's running out of time, that the rebellions that we've seen in Ukraine and in Georgia and in Moldova and in other places as well, the new independence of the Baltic countries, even in Kazakhstan, which has been a very strong ally of the Russians at OSCE, they had riots in the streets. They've seen the rebellions that are going on. And I think they believe that a democracy on their borders cannot be allowed to stand. And that's what I think they're doing. This is a terrible situation. The Ukrainians are entitled to our respect and our regard and our arms and our support and our military support in every way that we can send them arms to defend themselves. These are heroic people fighting for their independence. They should be in complete concord with the beliefs and values of the United States. They got some ways to go to clean up their old Soviet problems, but not much, not compared to Russia. So they should be independent. They're being violently attacked now, murdered and killed, but they are still fighting. And we need to be sending them everything that we can send them so they can defend themselves. Okay, so that's my opening remarks.
No, and it's just wonderful. I was thinking as you recited the countries that you dealt with, that is quite a stew of nationalities. Did they get along with each other?
Yes, they do. There are pressures and conflicts, of course. The Macedonians, for example, had to change the name of their country, but that was in order to make the Greeks happy, but that's okay. But then the Bulgarians had some issues. But I don't want to hit this too hard. They all understand who the real enemy is, and it's the Russians. You know, it doesn't have to be that way. When the Soviet Union fell and Yeltsin took over Russia, there was real promise there of a real hope that Russia might turn west and actually become a real country and do good things. But then Putin took over and it's now gone backwards. But now people all understand that. But the Western European countries are in pretty good shape. Of course, the British have departed from the European Union. The European Union is trying to become some sort of country, but I don't think they can succeed. But by and large, the countries of Europe get along with except for, well, some other pressures. Armenia is in the OSCE. Azerbaijan is in the OSCE. They went to war while I was there. There was an actual war there, which the Azerbaijanis won over the Nagorno-Karabakh, that enclave there. So Europe is not a stable continent, Chris. It's not a stable continent. When I came back, I said so. But these are the reasons why I think we have to keep a close eye on Europe. I might say to you, by the way, that I think it's too soon to be pivoting to Asia. I don't really have very much fear of the Chinese, honestly. They want to get across Taiwan. I don't think they can. I don't think they can get over that 100 miles of ocean in the face of the United States, the Australian and the Japanese navies. They have done, however, terrible violence to the Uyghurs. They're committing genocide there. They've violated all their treaty agreements with Hong Kong. They are an authoritarian country imposing authoritarian values on their own people. I believe they're guilty of crimes against humanity, but they're not a threat today. The Russians are a threat right now, and that has to be addressed.
I will take all the questions that we've gotten at this point. Starting with the one that was emailed to both of us before this even started. And Gordon asks what the odds may be that Putin could be cast out by his own people, and the extent to which USIA and the Voice of America and the CIA can play a role. Perhaps none, because it has to happen from within, but outsider pressure can always create a backlash. And I remember that the role of the USIA in the early 80s was tremendous in the Soviet Union and behind the Eastern Bloc. What are your thoughts on that?
I believe in it, and I'm going to talk to you about that. When I was the ambassador, I had a number of priorities I thought were important. And one of them was speaking to the Russian people. I pretty much concluded, based on my experience, that we were never going to be safe until Russia, the Russian people, became a democracy. And I still feel that way. So as ambassador, every time I gave my statement on Thursdays to the Permanent Council ambassadors, I always injected in a little message to the Russian people. And then we came back and we translated it into Russian and then put it out over the internet. Now, the Russian government has been trying to squelch all that kind of thing, but the point is not that. The point is that is exactly what I was doing. I figured the Russian people were smart enough to figure out how to listen to me if I put the message in the right place. I believe in the USIA. I believe in public communication as a matter generally of politics. I think in this particular modern world, it is vital. I think that it is a element of Western and American national power to be able to communicate our values and our ideas, because I think most people in the world will rally to us. Now, with that direct answer for that, there's an unknown question here, and that is, can Putin be deposed? Well, it's a long Russian tradition of deposing their leaders, but we don't know. But I'll say two things, and I've said this domestically too in some of my comments. You can't have a coup of any kind unless you control the secret police, the regular police, and the military. Right now, all those people seem to be behind Putin. So there's nothing that we can do other than to support the people who will fight, like the Ukrainians, to put our forces into Eastern Europe and into the Baltics, because I think the Russians are going to, once they get Ukraine conquered, will be trying to look for others. We need to be standing up for our NATO allies. We need to be doing all those things. And finally, this, if we're not going to put troops into Ukraine, and we're not, the risk has been deemed to be too high, then you have to turn to sanctions, which is what the economic warfare basically that we're doing. I don't think we're doing it anywhere near enough. The Europeans are starting to really buck up here and to really impose a lot of sanctions, and I think that's good. They're leading on this. Actually, I think the biggest leader that we've seen on this is probably the British Prime Minister, and they're all standing up. The United States needs to follow along and stand up very strong. Bottom line is, we should not be buying one barrel of oil from the Russians, not one. This is the moment when all of us conservatives believe the same thing. Time has come to stop all this nonsense, get the Keystone Pipeline going, start fracking, create energy independence, not only for ourselves, but for our friends and allies, and give them the opportunity to get away from Russian oil. And we should sure be getting away from Russian oil. And that at that point begins to put in real pressure on the Russian people. And that will translate into pressure on the military and the secret police, and ultimately we can maybe have a change, but we're very much too soon for that now.
You may have answered this, but Virginia asks, since you spoke at the James River Republican Women's Club several weeks ago, there have been obviously a lot of changes. You anticipated a lot of the current situation, but was there anything that surprised you about what happened? You certainly anticipated that it was going to happen, but.
Well, I predicted it because, and I'll say why. Listen, I didn't want to see this invasion. I had hoped that we could deter it. And I had hoped that by the President Biden rallying the Western European allies, who, as I've explained to you, were inclined to be with us anyway, and by doing what we were doing with the sanctions threats, that we could deter the Russians. That's what I had hoped. I never thought it would work. I always thought this invasion was going to occur. And the reason is because I assessed what I believe is going on in Putin's mind. Putin sees himself as a grand historic figure in the tradition of Joseph Stalin and Ivan the Terrible and Nicholas and Tsar Alexander. That's what he sees himself. He wants to reassemble the Russian Empire. He wants to have a Russian sphere of influence in Europe. That's what his goal is. He may be running out of time. He may have thought, this is the moment when I might get away with it. This is the moment when I'm looking at America divided on these social issues and on race and all this stuff that's going on. And this is the moment when I can pull the trigger. It's a big gamble for Putin, a big one, but he thinks it's worth it because this is the historic moment when he can reverse the loss of the Cold War. He can reverse the settlement of the Cold War and go back to the good old days of Russian dominance. I'm telling you, Chris, my worry has always been that if the United States didn't lead and stand up strong, What are these allied countries that I worked with going to do? What are they going to do?
Yeah.
If they're all by themselves over there against the Russian aggressor, I worry that it will influence the politics, certainly of the Eastern European and Baltic and Balkan countries, but even the Western European countries. That's why I think America has to lead and lead strongly.
Do you think Putin expected the kind of response that he's had from countries like Germany, which always sort of acquiesced, even Switzerland, which was always a neutral country? Nobody's neutral on this. Do you think he expected that kind of reaction from Europe?
No, I don't think he expected that. And again, we're not exactly sending in troops into Ukraine to fight side by side with Ukrainians. I'm not sure you have to. They do have 40 million people, and they're all now unified. Look, this is his game plan. No, he did not expect this. His game plan was to go in quick, conquer them, be as bloody as possible, completely crush the Ukrainian state, crush their military, depose President Zelensky, put in a puppet who then would say, oh, thank goodness, Mother Russia, now we can do what we're supposed to be doing, and that's be part of the Russian Empire like we always have been. That's what always wanted. And these crazy neo-Nazis with Zelensky had taken us on the wrong path. Now you have intervened and put us on the right path. That was his theory. He also expected that the Europeans would be divided and weak. And in fact, the Germans started out that way, didn't they? They were in trouble because of this Nord Stream 2 pipeline and their dependence on Russian gas. And they actually were breaking pretty bad. But they have done a 180 reversal, and now have been much stronger. The Europeans are looking like what I thought they would look like at OSCE. So I think Putin did not expect it. I kind of thought maybe the Europeans would be fine as long as America shows leadership. If America gets weak, I fear that the Europeans will make their best deals. But as long as the United States is strong, they want to be with us. Make no mistake about it. So I never expected the Swiss to do anything, by the way, even though my closest friend, maybe one of my very closest friends in Europe, was the Swiss ambassador. I could tell you some stories about that. He's a great guy. But I never expected them to breach their neutrality the way that they have. But there's a lot of strength here. Look, this is backfiring on Putin diplomatically. In Vienna, I was very close with the OSCE ambassadors from Sweden and Finland. They never left any doubt what team they were on, and they were on our team, even though they were neutral. Look what's happened now. They're talking about joining NATO. They understand the threat. So I think this is backfiring on Putin and backfiring on Russia. If we screw down these sanctions and weaken the Russian economy, which is not very strong anyway, the Russian people will notice. And then at that point, the power sources in Russia will also notice, and perhaps we can stop this.
The big question for a lot of folks is how does this all end? And in politics and diplomacy, I guess there's always a desire to provide a back entrance for people to get out of it. And Andy asks if there's an off-ramp we can give to Putin, since using nuclear weapons is as crazy as invading Ukraine. And so if he is that crazy, we need to avoid nuclear war. Should this be a factor? And if yes, how can we do that?
Let me tell you my thoughts about this. I'm not sure I'm always right, by the way, but I want to tell you my thoughts. But first of all, I don't think there's any danger of nuclear war. I just don't think you use nuclear weapons in a situation like this unless your country is completely threatened, and nobody is threatening Russia proper at this point. I think that's just a statement, but there's no threat of a nuclear attack. Second of all, on an off-ramp, I've heard a lot about this. We got to give Putin an off-ramp. We got to give him an off-ramp. Putin doesn't want an off-ramp. If you're going to offer an off-ramp, it's because you really think that they want to kind of quit or change or give up. And so now he's looking for a face-saving thing. We talked a lot about that before the invasion. I never thought he wanted an off-ramp. I don't think he wants an off-ramp now. I think he wants to win. He wants to win. If the Ukrainians Now destroy the Russian invaders, which I think is not likely, then maybe he might want an off ramp. We could offer him, but I don't think that's likely. Second of all, I want to talk about diplomacy for just a moment. I've always been very nervous by the Europeans during this time, this year that I've been back. And with this conflict beginning, talk about a diplomatic solution. Well, we need a diplomatic solution. Diplomat. Well, I was a diplomat. And yes, diplomacy is an element of national power. But let's remember that Neville Chamberlain was a diplomat. He wanted to avoid World War II, and he wanted to avoid Hitler going out and doing conquest. And so he was prepared to basically give up on Czechoslovakia and give up on any type of stand up against Adolf Hitler. So he did diplomacy. He went over to Munich and he folded and gave Hitler what he wanted. That was an act of diplomacy. So, diplomacy is no panacea. It's simply a way of communicating and negotiating in order to carry out national missions and to carry out national objectives without going to war. That's all diplomacy is. Or it's actually lining up countries to be in your favor and to create economic diplomacy and all this. It's all part of the same thing, though, Chris. All these are parts of the same thing: diplomacy, messaging, values, war. All these things are economics, all part of the same thing.
Gary, who's a candidate for Congress in Virginia's 7th district, says that obviously as he travels around the district, this is a topic of a lot of interest. His question is, from your perspective, what could have been done to forestall the Russian invasion? Could it have been prevented, and what actions and on what timeline could the actions have been taken?
I think at some point you need to get into a discussion of what really is motivating Putin. We have to be really careful. There are a lot of Americans that are thinking badly about the situation. Some of them say, well, we caused it because we extended NATO. And then there are some other Americans, and I have denounced them, by the way, who say, well, Ukraine doesn't matter, so we ought to just tend to our own business here in the United States and ignore all this international relations. I think all that is wrong. What could we have done to forestall this? I think we could have armed the Ukrainians completely earlier. We've come a long way here, Chris, a long way. When President Biden went into office, he actually invited this attack, I believe. I think that Putin's actually been fairly careful. I think he's probed several times to find out what would happen if he did this. The first thing that they did was he began to build up forces on Ukraine, and said, but I'll go to a summit, President Biden, if you'll meet me on a summit. I wrote an article that said there should have been no summit. President Biden gave him a summit. That built him up in the eyes of Europe and the world, made him a statesman, sort of. President Trump had put on sanctions on Nord Stream 2, the gas pipeline to Germany. As soon as President Biden got there, he took them off. The New START treaty program, the New START nuclear treaty. President Trump was trying to negotiate a tougher treaty there because the Russians had been violating the treaty and putting in nuclear powered missiles into Europe. He wanted to have that part of an extension negotiation. When President Biden came in, he just gave them the extension, didn't even ask them to touch their missiles, which are today pointed at Western Europe. So he invited that by showing weakness. Now, I believe that the president has done a 180. I believe that he figured it out, and I believe that he is now behaving much more strong. He has sent troops into Eastern Europe, which was absolutely the right thing to do. If you're not going to use troops, he's threatened real sanctions. We need to be doing real sanctions. I have said publicly that whatever sanctions he's thought about, he ought to do them and double them. We ought to be driving down the Russian economy and making the Russian people feel it. That's what we ought to be doing. The question was, what could we have done before? If we had put troops, real troops, the NATO powers had put troops into Ukraine, I believe this never would have occurred. But the risk was extremely high, and nobody chose to take that risk. So now, where are we? I think that if we had armed Ukraine with javelins and stingers a year ago, this probably would not have happened, but we didn't. We have been feeling our way along also. And quite frankly, we're doing the right things now, but I think it may be too late.
Did the disaster in Afghanistan embolden Putin to think that there would be no adequate response?
Absolutely, Chris. That's usually part of my speech. I gave you several of the things that he did to invite them. I think that the what I call the Afghanistan catastrophe, absolutely sent a message, and not just to Putin either. Sent it to the entire world that we were ready to write off our friends and leave them behind while the planes took off suddenly, and we abandoned people to the people that we have been fighting. So strong message. A strong message. I can assure you that all of my friends in the ambassador community, all across OSCE, saw that message. I can promise you that. There's no antidote to it, by the way, other than strength. So I think President Biden is stuck. I think he's got to be a strong leader now, or this is going to get a lot worse.
John and Barbara, actually three people and someone who's anonymous, asked a question. And it's all sort of the same thing, which is more military involvement, finding volunteer or mercenary pilots, creating a sort of flying tigers for the Ukraine. Should there be a no-fly zone if NATO would join in? Why not do a no-fly zone? What's the size of the Ukrainian Air Force? So that's ratcheting up a bit more in terms of the military perspective. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, of course, Putin's nuclear threat was intended to actually brush all that kind of thing back. We have made a policy decision that we're not going to get into a direct military confrontation with the Russian army. We've just decided that we're not going to do it. We're not going to do it with the Russian Air Force. We're not going to do it with the Russian Navy. We're not going to do those things. Instead, we have decided to use sanctions. We have decided to rally our allies, which we have done. The Turks wouldn't even let the Russians send warships into the Black Sea. That is really good, because at OSCE, we've had a lot of tensions with the Turks, as you know. And now they have rallied to this. These are startling diplomatic advancements. The bottom line is, I do not believe that we are going to put troops into Ukraine, and I don't think we should. Maybe a year ago, we might have put in some people as tripwires. We didn't do it. We have made a decision that it's too dangerous to go to war with Russia. And that's a decision we've made. I don't think we can reverse that at this point, but we can arm the Ukrainians. They're doing pretty good.
Yeah.
They're doing pretty good.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, I don't know how Putin thinks he's going to do his original plan. He's not going to be able to actually reverse Ukraine and try to make them a satrap of Russia. He's not going to be able to do that. When I came back from Kyiv in May of 21, I knew that he couldn't do that. These are resolute people. They do not see themselves as breakaway Russians. They see themselves as Ukrainians. And believe me, they have a long and proud tradition. One more thing, they told me that they looked at their historical traditions as being more towards the Black Sea Byzantine area. They see the Russians as entirely alien, entirely different tradition. So invading Ukraine really isn't any different than invading Poland. Not really.
No.
And Putin didn't, I think, at least if he either didn't understand it or he hoped to reverse history. He's not going to be able to do that.
So let's assume that Putin did take all the cities. Would he be facing an insurgency for the next 10 years from the hills and the mountains? Would this be Russia's second Afghanistan?
Yes, I hope so. The Ukrainians intend to do that. And we intend to supply them across those borders on eastern Ukraine. We intend to do that, I believe, and they intend to do it. I got to tell you that I'm not confident that an insurgency can work. But, this is a little different experience here. This is 40 million people that are resolute. He was hoping that there would be some big Russian-speaking insurgency of his own and insurrection against the Ukrainian government, which has not occurred.
Right.
This invasion, I think, has united the Ukrainian people completely, no matter what language they speak.
And most of Europe, which is also amazing. Puneet asks what the likelihood is that Ukraine would become part of NATO, and I assume that assumes a good resolution to this.
Well, that's right. We don't know what the ultimate result is going to be. When I was in Kyiv, I met with, as I said, about 16 cabinet ministers. They all had the same talking points. I mean, they all said the same thing to our delegation. We want to join NATO. We want to join NATO. It looks to me like that we don't know what the result of this is going to be, Puneet. And by the way, I appreciate your leadership and your candidacy, as you know. We don't know. I think that the Ukrainians are resolute in moving west. I think that this war is intended to stop that. What's going to happen? We don't know what's going to happen at this point. But I will say one more thing on your guerrilla issue, your insurgency issue. I mean, think about it this way. If that's going to happen, it's going to have to be supplied across those borders from the Czech Republics, the Slovak Republic, Romania, Hungary, Poland. That's what's going to have to happen. Those are all NATO countries. If they are running guns, javelins, hand grenades, missiles across that border in the dead of night, that is a direct confrontation between the Russian conqueror and NATO. So this game is far from over. This is a very dangerous future that we're facing.
Kevin asks what you would say to the Indian ambassador regarding India's abstention on the UN vote against Russia.
I would say to the Indians that they are a very powerful country that the Americans respect because of their population, because of their leadership, because of their technology. And what the hell do they think they're doing? They need to get real here. This is a long war that is ahead of us here. Now, I'm not talking about the Ukrainian war. I'm talking about the war between the authoritarian countries and the freedom countries. This is going to be maybe a 100-year war to determine what the future of the world is going to be. Is it going to be an authoritarian future, the way the Russians and the Chinese handled their populations, or is it going to be free democracies? This is the battle that is underway. It's going to be a long, long battle. India ought to be on the right side there. Neutrality is never a good place to be when the chips are down, and the chips are down.
Bob Lewis, who identifies himself as a reporter, he's a reporter for the Virginia Mercury.
Know him well. We go to church together when I go to church.
All right. So he asks, I think you've answered the question, which is what did the Biden administration fail to do that it could have done or could have done, A, to dissuade Russia in advance, or B, bolster Ukraine in advance? And I think you've kind of answered that question.
I've covered it. I really regret what President Biden was doing. I think this was not tough diplomacy. They should have understood this. And they made a lot of mistakes, I think. And the Afghan catastrophe was the worst mistake, but it wasn't the only one. The relations with Russia directly were terrible mistakes and invited this. I repeat again, Bob, President Biden has done a 180. He's doing the right things now with the facilities that he has at his command. It's just a little late. And sadly enough, the Ukrainian people are paying that price right now.
John asked a question I don't know can be answered. What does a post-war world look like? It's too soon to call. Deposing Putin is a start, but should we divide Russia east and west like Germany? The ultimate outcome is that if Russia should be punished, is there a way to win the war and reorganize the government while assuring that the Russian people don't suffer any more than they had to?
No, there's no way from the outside to change Russia and the boundaries. That's why they have the nuclear weapons. However, I'm optimistic. Honestly, I told you a few minutes ago, I think we're in a multi-generational war for the future of the world. The question was asked, what's the world going to look like when this is over with? This is only the very, very beginning of the conflict that is underway, that is going to go on for a very long time. Now, I will also be real optimistic here. I think that the authoritarians underestimated how really tied into the West they really are, to the modern world as represented by the West. I think they're a little startled by the fact that their economies are so tied in. You know, they're playing Olympic games with us. They're doing trade with us. And all of a sudden, I think at least the Chinese, who are very tied into the Western economies, are beginning to wake up and say, hey, wait a minute, what are we doing to ourselves here? I think that they would like to go in combination with other authoritarian countries and create an authoritarian world. And at the end of this 100 years, maybe that's where we'll be, Chris. I hope not, and I expect not. I believe that the values that exist in the human heart for democracy and liberty are not pollutable, are not mitigatable. And I believe that in the long run, we win, because I believe that the Chinese people and the Russian people want to be as free as anybody else does. But the authoritarians don't agree with that. They think they can dominate the world by force. They think they can dominate their own people by force. I actually don't believe they can in the long run, but we're going to have a long war until that conclusion is reached.
Well, Ambassador, I'll say that I've never had this many questions come in on one of these webinars so far, and we're running out of time, because I know you have a media interview at 8:15, and I promised we'd get out. There's a question from Jocelyn. Do you think Russia also wants to extend its sphere of influence in Africa? And is the Russia presence in Mali and in the Republic of Central Africa for real, or just a bargaining chip?
I don't think that the Russians need bargaining chips, because I don't think they're bargaining. If you're gonna gather chips, that's because you think you're going to make a deal. I don't see them making any deals. I think that they have committed themselves now to conquest by force in the short and the long run. Although, if they can get the Eastern Europeans to make deals with them after we're gone, they would do that. They don't really have to invade Eastern Europe if they can impinge upon their power. That's true. But the African question, I think that that's a long way off. I think that we can rely upon some of our allies to carry some of the weight in Africa. And I'm not too concerned about that right now. And I'll tell you why. Because the big game is underway. The big game is underway. It's funny. I've often said that when I came back that I'm not worried about the Chinese. I think they're a problem in 5 years. The Russians are a problem today. But I want to say this before we hang up, Chris. I think it's extremely important. I want to refute people either in this meeting or beyond this meeting who do not think this is important and think that America ought to come home and stay home. That is not correct. You have to ask yourself the question this way: is American safety, security, freedom, is Europe important to that? Is Europe important to America's existence? If you don't think Europe is important to America's existence, let it go. And you'll be crazy, because Europe is essential to American safety. American safety. If we didn't learn that lesson in World War II, we didn't learn anything. We're too stupid to learn. This is a time when we have to recognize that the world we live in is an integrated, complete global world. I guess people talk about globalism as being something that's bad. I do not believe in surrendering America's national interests, America's first interests, America's sovereignty to anything global. I do not believe in that. But I think we'd be foolish to not recognize our chief advantage. And our chief advantage is we have allies and friends across the world, and the authoritarians don't. And that's because they're basically fundamentally evil in the way that they try to govern.
Well, there are probably there's a whole bunch more questions, and I apologize to everyone that we can't get to, but I know a summation when I hear it, and that is a superb summation of American interest. And Ambassador, thank you so much for being with us tonight. I appreciate it. To everyone, we will be posting this on our website. We will be putting it on our Jefferson Policy Journal, and we will send you the link so you can watch it. I appreciate it very much. Ambassador, thank you.
Keep up the good work of the Jefferson Foundation. We're proud of you.
Thank you, sir. All righty. Thank you, folks. Appreciate it. Have a great evening, and say a prayer.